This is a CBS News special report. President Carter reports to the Congress on the Camp David summit. I'm Neil Strasser, CBS News, reporting on the CBS radio network. The scene is familiar. The members of the House and Senate gathered in the House chamber for this joint session, the panoply of the House doorkeeper announcing the arrival of members of the diplomatic corps and so forth, and the galleries filled with distinguished guests. One of those guests who came in just a moment ago, you can still hear the applause, President Sadat of Egypt, one of the participants in the Camp David Summit Conference, which lasted for 13 days. And now there also is Menachem Begin, the Prime Minister of Israel, who is shaking hands with President Sadat. They're on either side of Rosalind Carter, the First Lady, all in the gallery up to the speaker's left. That's the distinguished visitors gallery. Everyone on the House floor standing and applauding these two leaders who joined President Carter for those talks which led to the signing last night of those two agreements on a framework for peace in the Middle East. Shortly, Mr. Carter will be announced for this report on the Camp David summit, which follows a day of some disillusionment perhaps, which we'll note in our following summary and analysis. This is more than a report in one sense.
Mr. Speaker, the President's Cabinet.
Mr. President's Cabinet.
That's the House doorkeeper, James Malloy, announcing the President's Cabinet. And they make their way down the aisle, the members of the Cabinet. This is Secretary Vance leading the way, smiling, our participant throughout those many days and many long hours at Camp David. This is more than a report in one sense, because President Carter must also ask the Congress for some eventual action. As we learned today, he must ask for funds eventually to build two airfields for Israel in the Negev Desert to replace those that Israel would give up in the Sinai. That is, if the Sinai is returned to Egypt, and it would be under terms of the agreements worked out if some arrangement is made for return of the Israeli settlements in the Sinai. And that's something that the Israeli Knesset is supposed to vote on within 2 weeks. We learned today also that Prime Minister Begin has said he will not urge the acceptance of giving up those settlements, but will probably take no position in the Knesset debate.
The President of the United States.
Now the announcement by James Malloy, the doorkeeper. The President enters, escorted by an appointed committee, always of top members of the House and Senate. The House Democratic leader, Jim Wright, Senate Majority Leader Robert Byrd, we see. Others following behind. He makes his way up toward the podium, hands copies of his speech to the Vice President and to the Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, part of the tradition in making the report to a joint session. Speaker O'Neill will introduce the President. For the moment, everyone's still standing and applauding, and he's looking up to his left now, smiling at President Sadat, Prime Minister Begin, and his wife, Rosalind. "13 days at the summit. Last night, of course, the three of them taking part in the ceremony announcing the outline, only really, of the agreements that they reached in signing those agreements.
Members of the Congress, I have the high privilege and the distinct honor of presenting to you the President of the United States.
Again, everyone stands. Matter of courtesy, members on both sides of the aisle. President, blue shirt, blue suit.
Vice President Mondale, Speaker O'Neill, distinguished members of the United States Congress, justices of the Supreme Court, other leaders of our great nation, ladies and gentlemen, it's been more than 2,000 years since there was peace between Egypt and a free Jewish nation. If our present expectations are realized, this year we shall see such peace again. The first thing I would like to do is to give tribute to the two men who made this impossible dream now become a real possibility. The two great leaders with whom I have met for the last 2 weeks at Camp David. First, President Anwar Sadat of Egypt.
President Sadat rises, bowing his head little bits, standing everyone in the crowd, but alongside him Rosalind, and on the other side of Rosalind Carter, Prime Minister Begin also applauding President Sadat. And President Carter also applauding as he looks up toward the gallery.
And the other, of course, is Prime Minister Menachem Begin of the nation of Israel.
One stands. Again, everyone stands. The slowest to rise, the Prime Minister of Israel, who inclines his head toward the audience below. Next to Prime Minister Begin, we believe, is his wife. These two leaders, of course, have been having separate interviews today and putting a somewhat different cast, perhaps, in the agreement speech last night. We'll have more on that later.
I know that all of you would agree that these are two men of great personal courage, representing nations of peoples who are deeply grateful to them for the achievement which they have realized. And I am personally grateful to them for what they have done. At Camp David, we sought a peace that is not only of vital importance to their own two nations, but to all the people of the Middle East, to all the people of the United States, and indeed to all the world as well. The world prayed for the success of our efforts, and I am glad to announce to you that these prayers have been answered. I've come to discuss with you tonight what these two leaders have accomplished and what this means to all of us. The United States has had no choice but to be deeply concerned about the Middle East and to try to use our influence and our efforts to advance the cause of peace. For the last 30 years, through 4 wars, the people of this troubled region have paid a terrible price in suffering and division and hatred and bloodshed. No two nations have suffered more than Egypt and Israel. But the dangers and the cost of conflicts in this region for our own nation have been great as well. We have long-standing friendships among the nations there and the peoples of the region, and we have profound moral commitments which are deeply rooted in our values as a people. The strategic location of these countries and the resources that they possess mean that events in the Middle East directly affect people everywhere. We and our friends could not be indifferent if a hostile power were to establish domination there. In few areas of the world is there a greater risk that a local conflict could spread among other nations adjacent to them and then perhaps erupt into a tragic confrontation between us superpowers ourselves. Our people have come to understand that unfamiliar names like Sinai, Aqaba, Sharm el-Sheikh, Ras el-Nakba, Gaza, the West Bank of Jordan, can have a direct and immediate bearing on our own well-being as a nation and our hope for a peaceful world. That is why we in the United States cannot afford to be idle bystanders, why we have been full partners in the search for peace, and why it is so vital to our nation that these meetings at Camp David have been a success. Through the long years of conflict, 4 main issues have divided the parties involved. One is the nature of peace. Whether peace will simply mean that the guns are silenced, that the bombs no longer fall, that the tanks cease to roll, or whether it will mean that the nations of the Middle East can deal with each other as neighbors and as equals and as friends with a full range of diplomatic and cultural and economic and human relations between them. That's been the basic question. The Camp David Agreement has defined such relationships, I'm glad to announce to you, between Israel and Egypt. The second main issue is providing for the security of all parties involved, including, of course, our friends, the Israelis, so that none of them need fear attack or military threats from one another. When implemented, the Camp David Agreement, I'm glad to announce to you, will provide for such mutual security. Third is the question of agreement on secure and recognized boundaries. The end of military occupation and the granting of self-government, or else the return to other nations of territories which have been occupied by Israel since the 1967 conflict. The Camp David Agreement, I'm glad to announce to you, provides for the realization of all these goals. And finally, there is the painful human question of the fate of the Palestinians who live or who have lived in these disputed regions. The Camp David Agreement guarantees that the Palestinian people may participate in the resolution of the Palestinian problem in all its aspects, a commitment that Israel has made in writing and which is supported and appreciated, I'm sure, by all the world. Over the last 18 months, there has been, of course, some progress on these issues. Egypt and Israel came close to agreeing about the first issue, the nature of peace. They then saw that the second and third issues, that is, withdrawal and security, were intimately connected, closely entwined, but fundamental divisions still remained in other areas about the fate of the Palestinians, the future of the West Bank and Gaza, and the future of Israeli settlements in occupied Arab territories. We all remember the hopes for peace that were inspired by President Sadat's initiative, that great and historic visit to Jerusalem last November that thrilled the world, and by the warm and genuine personal response of Prime Minister Begin and the Israeli people, and by the mutual promise between them, publicly made, that there would be no more war. These hopes were sustained when Prime Minister Begin reciprocated by visiting Ismailia on Christmas Day. That progress continued, but at a slower and slower pace through the early part of the year. And by early summer, the negotiations had come to a standstill once again. It was this stalemate and the prospect for an even worse future that prompted me to invite both President Sadat and Prime Minister Begin to join me at Camp David. They accepted, as you know, instantly, without delay, without preconditions, without consultation even between them. It's impossible to overstate the courage of these two men or the foresight they have shown. Only through high ideals, through compromises of words and not principles, and through a willingness to look deep into the human heart and to understand the problems and hopes and dreams of one another, can progress in a difficult situation like this ever be made. That's what these men and their wise and diligent advisors who are here with us tonight have done during the last 13 days. When this conference began, I said that the prospects for success were remote. Enormous barriers of ancient history and nationalism and suspicion would have to be overcome if we were to meet our objectives. But President Sadat and Prime Minister Begin have overcome these barriers, exceeded our fondest expectations, and have signed 2 agreements that hold out the possibility of resolving issues that history had taught us could not be resolved. The first of these documents is entitled A Framework for Peace in the Middle East, agreed at Camp David. It deals with a comprehensive settlement between Israel and all her neighbors, as well as a difficult question of the Palestinian people and the future of the West Bank and the Gaza area. The agreement provides a basis for the resolution of issues involving the West Bank and Gaza during the next 5 years. It outlines a process of change which is in keeping with Arab hopes, while also carefully respecting Israel's vital security. The Israeli military government over these areas will be withdrawn and will be replaced with a self-government of the Palestinians who live there. And Israel has committed that this government will have full autonomy. Prime Minister Begin said to me several times, not partial autonomy, but full autonomy. Israeli forces will be withdrawn and redeployed into specified locations to protect Israel's security. The Palestinians will further participate in determining their own future through talks in which their own elected representatives, the inhabitants of the West Bank and Gaza, will negotiate with Egypt and Israel and Jordan to determine the final status of the West Bank and Gaza. Israel has committed themselves that the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people will be recognized. After the signing of this framework last night, and during the negotiations concerning the establishment of the Palestinian self-government, no new Israeli settlements will be established in this area. The future settlements issue will be decided among the negotiating parties. The final status of the West Bank and Gaza will be decided before the end of the 5-year transitional period during which the Palestinian Arabs will have their own government. As part of a negotiation which will produce a peace treaty between Israel and Jordan, specifying borders, withdrawal, all those very crucial issues. These negotiations will be based on all the provisions and the principles of Security Council Resolution 242, with which you all are so familiar. The agreement on the final status of these areas will then be submitted to a vote by the representatives of the inhabitants of the West Bank and Gaza. And they will have the right for the first time in their history, the Palestinian people, to decide how they will govern themselves permanently. We also believe, of course, all of us, that there should be a just settlement of the problems of displaced persons and refugees, which takes into account appropriate United Nations resolutions. Finally, this document also outlines a variety of security arrangements to reinforce peace between Israel and her neighbors. This is, indeed, a comprehensive and fair framework for peace in the Middle East, and I'm glad to report this to you. The second agreement is entitled A Framework for the Conclusion of a Peace Treaty between Egypt and Israel. It returns to Egypt its full exercise of sovereignty over the Sinai Peninsula and establishes several security zones, recognizing carefully that sovereignty right for the protection of all parties. It also provides that Egypt will extend full diplomatic recognition to Israel at the time the Israelis complete an interim withdrawal from most of the Sinai, which will take place between 3 months and 9 months after the conclusion of the peace treaty. And the peace treaty is to be fully negotiated and signed no later than 3 months from last night. I think I should also report that Prime Minister Begin and President Sadat have already challenged each other to conclude the treaty even earlier, and I hope they... This final conclusion of a peace treaty will be completed late in December, and it would be a wonderful Christmas present for the world. Final and complete withdrawal of all Israeli forces will take place between 2 and 3 years following the conclusion of the peace treaty. While both parties are in total agreement on all the goals that I have just described to you, there is one issue on which agreement has not yet been reached. Egypt states that agreement to remove the Israeli settlements from Egyptian territory is a prerequisite to a peace treaty. Israel says that the issue of the Israeli settlements should be resolved during the peace negotiations themselves. Now, within 2 weeks, with each member of the Knesset or the Israeli parliament acting as individuals not constrained by party loyalty, the Knesset will decide on the issue of the settlements. Our own government's position, my own personal position, is well known on this issue and has been consistent. It is my strong hope, my prayer, that the question of Israeli settlements on Egyptian territory will not be the final obstacle to peace. None of us should underestimate the historic importance of what has already been done. This is the first time that an Arab and an Israeli leader have signed a comprehensive framework for peace. It contains the seeds of a time when the Middle East, with all its vast potential, may be a land of human richness and fulfillment, rather than a land of bitterness and continued conflict. No region in the world has greater natural and human resources than this one. And nowhere have they been more heavily weighed down by intense hatred and frequent war. These agreements hold out the real possibility that this burden might finally be lifted. But we must also not forget the magnitude of the obstacles that still remain. The summit exceeded our highest expectations. Well, we know that it left many difficult issues which are still to be resolved. These issues will require careful negotiation in the months to come. The Egyptian and Israeli people must recognize the tangible benefits that peace will bring and support the decisions their leaders have made so that a secure and a peaceful future can be achieved for them. The American public, you and I, must also offer our full support to those who have made decisions that are difficult and those who have very difficult decisions still to make. What lies ahead for all of us is to recognize the statesmanship that President Sadat and Prime Minister Begin have shown, and to invite others in that region to follow their example. I have already last night invited the other leaders of the Arab world to help sustain progress toward a comprehensive peace. We must also join in an effort to bring an end to the conflict and the terrible suffering in Lebanon. This is a subject that President Sadat discussed with me many times while I was in Camp David with him. And the first time that the three of us met together, this was a subject of heated discussion. On the way to Washington last night in a helicopter, we mutually committed ourselves to join with other nations, with the Lebanese people themselves, all factions, with President Sarkis, with Syria and Saudi Arabia, perhaps the European countries like France, to try to move toward a resolution of the problem in Lebanon, which is so vital to us and to the poor people in Lebanon who have suffered so much. We will want to consult on this matter and on these documents and their meaning with all of the leaders, particularly the Arab leaders. And I'm pleased to say to you tonight that just a few minutes ago, King Hussein of Jordan and King Khalid of Saudi Arabia, perhaps other leaders later, but these two have already agreed to receive Secretary Vance, who will be leaving tomorrow, to explain to them the terms of the Camp David agreement.
The Secretary, of course, sitting in the audience, smiling a bit as the applause flows around him.
And we hope to secure their support for the realization of the new hopes and dreams of the people of the Middle East. This is an important mission, and this responsibility, I can tell you, based on my last 2 weeks with him, could not possibly rest on the shoulders of a more able and dedicated and competent man than Secretary Cyrus Vance. Finally, let me say that for many years, the Middle East has been a textbook for pessimism, a demonstration that diplomatic ingenuity was no match for intractable human conflicts. Today, we are privileged to see the chance for one of the sometimes rare, bright moments in human history, a chance that may offer the way to peace. We have a chance for peace because these two brave leaders found within themselves the willingness to work together to seek these lasting peace, these lasting prospects for peace, which we all want so badly. And for that, I hope that you will share my prayer of thanks and my hope that the promise of this moment shall be fully realized. The prayers at Camp David were the same as those of the shepherd King David, who prayed in the 85th Psalm, "Wilt thou not revive us again, that thy people may rejoice in thee? I will hear what God the Lord will speak, for he will speak peace unto his people and unto his saints, but let them not return again unto folly." And I would like to say, as a Christian, to these two friends of mine, the words of Jesus: "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be the children of God."
This is Neil Strasser in Washington. President Carter, at the end of this report to the Congress, the joint session on the Camp David summit, turning away, shaking hands with the Speaker of the House, the Vice President. Now the process will be reversed. He walks back down toward the aisle and will be escorted back up the aisle by the leaders of the Congress. Shaking hands with the Democratic leader of the Senate, Robert Byrd, the Republican leader of the Senate, Howard Baker, and Jacob Javits, Republican of New York, and many others as he makes his slow way back up the aisle. The President opening this speech by saying it's been more than 2,000 years since there was peace between Egypt and a free Jewish nation. If our present expectations are realized, he said, this year we shall see such peace again. Then he went on to pay tribute to President Sadat of Egypt and Prime Minister Begin of Israel, both sitting in the gallery up to his left, calling them men of great courage. He said the world prayed for the success of our efforts, and those prayers have been answered. Mr. Carter went on to list the problems in the Middle East and give some details of the two agreements signed last night after the Camp David summit. The agreement providing for continuing those negotiations on the status of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and the agreement that his hope will lead within 3 months to a peace agreement between Egypt and Israel, with the process for return of the Sinai Peninsula beginning. And that, Mr. Carter said, would be a very good Christmas present for the nation. At the end of his speech, he had two announcements to make. There was some summitry continuing in the helicopter returning from Camp David after they left that Catoctin mountaintop. They talked about the problem of Lebanon. Mr. Carter said at Camp David, when they first discussed it, there was a heated discussion. You are hearing, I think, perhaps, the crowd still applauding President Sadat of Egypt and Prime Minister Begin. But President Carter has left the chamber, and our broadcast also leaves that chamber. Mr. Carter said that when they first discussed at Camp David the problem of Lebanon, it was a heated discussion. But on the way back from Camp David in the helicopter, he said the leaders agreed to form in a concerted effort with other nations of the world to try to do something about that warfare in Lebanon, the warfare between the Palestinians and the rightist Christian forces, and to try to restore peace to that torn country. And he went on to say, I'm pleased to say that King Hussein of Jordan and King Khalid of Saudi Arabia have now agreed to receive Secretary of State Vance, who will be leaving tomorrow to explain to them the terms of the Camp David agreement, and said Mr. Carter to secure their support for the realization of the new hopes and dreams of the people of the Middle East. Well, of course, that's a very important trip by Secretary of State Vance, and I think we'll bring in now Robert Pierpoint, our White House correspondent Bruce Morton, because the participation in this peace settlement of Jordan and the financial support of Saudi Arabia is extremely important. It's one of those obstacles we've been talking about during this second day after signing the agreement. Is that not right, Bruce Morton?
Well, Neil, the President said in his speech at one point that the Middle East has been a textbook for pessimism, and maybe we're all just too used to that. But sure, you can look at this thing and see any one of a number of ways in which it might fall apart. If King Hussein won't play, if the Saudis won't play, if the PLO, which has already attacked the so-called framework, announces some sort of Palestinian boycott of it and no Palestinian on the West Bank wants to play, if the Knesset votes the wrong way on what to do about the Israeli settlements in the Sinai, all of these things could bring it down. But I must say what struck me was that President Carter tonight, I guess for the first time in his presidency, went up to Capitol Hill as a genuine hero. They interrupted his speech something like 17 times. Nobody did that when he was vetoing water projects. They really cheered. You could hear voices saying hooray or bravo or whatever it was. And that's a brand new experience for this president, who has been considered by the Congress to be politically maladroit, frequently incompetent, and generally not quite up to the job. Now, in 6 weeks, by the November elections, he may be a bum again, but he's riding very high tonight.
Robert Pierpoint, your thoughts?
Certainly, I would agree with Bruce that I would point out one of the interesting reasons, in my view, for why he's riding high, and that is a feeling of genuine relief on the part of many of those members of Congress that they aren't going to have to deal for some time with the problem of troubles in the Middle East between Israel and the Arabs, and with its fallout on their political careers in the Jewish community here in the United States. The recent fight over the aid to Saudi Arabia, the military package problem, brought it very close to home to all of those members of Congress that the Jewish community has a great deal of strength in this country. And right now, Mr. Carter is a hero partly because he's lifted that burden from these members of Congress.
Bob, you might say today was the day of the fine print. Last night we had the outlines of the agreements. Today we read the agreements, and we read of the letters to being exchanged that will help implement them, and we heard interviews with Begin and Sadat. Does all that seem to support what President Sadat last night called a historic moment?
Well, I think there isn't any question but what we are living in a historic moment right now, what we have seen today in reading some of the fine print brings a little sobriety to the scene. I think we all now recognize that, as Bruce has very well pointed out, it could fall apart, this whole framework, in several different directions. And yet, I'd like to make the point that a process has been started here by the agreements that is very hard to stop. Now, there are going to be troubles down the line, and I thought Mr. Carter, when he talked about the chance for peace, used the right term there. There are going to be serious problems, but it's going to be awfully hard to unwind all that has been done at Camp David. And I think that Mr. Sadat and Mr. Begin are aware of that. And they are aware that their own people are going to maintain the pressure on them, as President Carter has asked us all to maintain the pressures on him and on them, so that I don't see the momentum of this slowing down very easily. In fact, I would say that we really haven't moved very far toward peace, but there is a momentum building.
One other point, Bob. President Sadat has been telling interviewers all day that, no, this is not a separate peace with Israel. But the fact is that American spokesmen have been pointing out that these two agreements, the one more general and the other simply between Israel and Egypt, are separate. They may be emotionally linked, but they are separate. Doug Sefton, CBS News' man in Cairo, was saying to you and me, Neil, earlier this evening that a separate peace really might be a pretty good thing for President Sadat. He's got a lot of domestic troubles, and what he needs is a little peace, even if it's at the price of some criticism from the more radical Arab states. If the Saudis will go along with him, maybe that's not a bad deal for him.
Well, and I believe also that the people of Egypt don't really care that much about the Palestinians on the West Bank. That Arab unity is not all that important to most Egyptians, so that separate peace would certainly float very well in Egypt itself. As you point out, the problem is the Saudis, who give great financial backing and support to Sadat and to Egypt, are the real question mark, and that's why I think Secretary Vance's mission to the Middle East in this next week or so is going to be vitally important.
That's one of the things we'll be watching very closely. Another, of course, will be that vote in the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, within 2 weeks on the matter of return of the settlements in the Sinai to Egypt. And today we heard from President Sadat that he probably will take no position on that. It had been expected, I think, in some of the first flush of success last night that...
You mean Prime Minister?
Prime Minister Sadat, Prime Minister Begin, that he would urge return of those settlements, but today he said he probably would not speak out in debate at all, and if he did, he might not say what would please the Americans, his American interviewer at least.
But I have a suspicion, based on some conversations here at the White House, Neil, that the fix is in on that, that there's a pretty strong belief that even though Begin himself might not personally support the removal of those settlements, the votes are there for that to pass.
Well, on that note, we'll close out and tell our audience this has been a CBS News special report. President Carter reports to the Congress on the Camp David Summit. And with my great thanks to my colleagues, Robert Pierpoint and Bruce Morton, I'm Neil Strasser, CBS News.